argued that China's continued prosperity is important not only to the United States, but to the globe. And that central to China's continued prosperity is the way that it manages urbanization. Now, it's not often that I found myself in agreement with Paulson, but at some level, this is a formulation that captures some of what I'm trying to get at. So the first proposition is that urbanization across the world is broad enough and deep enough that what we're really talking about is global transformation, that processes of globalization and urbanization have converged. For the first time in human history, we are primarily an urban species. And urban forms are increasingly the predominant global forms, whether we're talking about built environment or culture or politics. Sometime in the last decade, the urban population globally passed 50%, and that's unprecedented. And that's only going to grow. It'll peak around 2050 and then level off. These are tough estimates to make, but the best estimates, that's what they're telling us. So looked at another way, we can say that globalization in many key respects works through cities. It occurs through cities. So if you look at global financial flows, for example, something that's been talked about a lot lately, it's not simply that certain key cities, prominent cities, like New York and London and Tokyo, serve as command and control centers of the global economy, that the processes of economic globalization are shaped by these key cities. That's true. But it's also that cities themselves, all kinds of cities, become destinations for financial capital. Local real estate markets become enmeshed in these flows in ways that dramatically transform localities, but also in ways that turn localities more like each other. So we see a kind of homogenization across the urban world, even as cities themselves are dramatically transformed internally and fragmented internally. The second proposition is that the Asia-Pacific region will only continue to grow in importance as a global urban center, and that's for a number of reasons, not least of which is that it is a global and urban population center. The Asia-Pacific region, or the APR, represents the second least urbanized region in the world. But it's also the second fastest urbanizing region, 29%, I think, population growth over the last decade, I think. Now, global urban studies, which is the interdisciplinary academic discipline that I work in, has only relatively recently begun to move away from using case studies from what we call the global north, the cities of Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand to some extent, has only recently begun to decenter those cities in studying cities on a global scale. And as the APR region continues to develop as a global urban center, the importance of cities for APR studies will continue to grow. So my interest here is kind of twofold. On the one hand, I want to help to develop the global urban studies component of Asia-Pacific Rim studies. But I also want to contribute to global urban studies by doing empirical work that's based in what is a re-emergent global and urban center. The final proposition, that the city itself is growing in importance as a scale of economic, cultural, and political analysis and action. Now, personally, what I'm really interested in is looking at the city as an agglomeration of social problems and social innovation. And I'm referring to the usual suspects: housing, sanitation, environment, public health, and so on, but also to what I see as the fundamental problem of politics. That is, the city becomes an essential reference point for the question of governance and democracy on a global scale. So I came to these propositions through work. It's a comparative multi-city project that includes Shanghai and New Delhi, which I'll talk about tonight, but also Cape Town, South Africa. So let me turn to the work itself. So why Shanghai and New Delhi? Why those two cities? Well, to start, as the two most populated cities in the two most populous countries, it makes sense that if you're looking at urban centrality, this becomes a place that you might want to turn. These are important cities. At the same time, however, especially since I'm interested in generalizability, there's a danger in trying to draw generalizations from cases that are not representative of cities in general. And I'll say something more about that in a minute. Another reason, one that's just as compelling to me, is the rapid growth of Shanghai and New Delhi over the past 20 years as their respective national governments implemented economic growth strategies in which investment in urban cores played a central role. The transformation over these decades, beginning in the late 80s, early 90s, involved initiatives to decentralize governance from the national to the urban scale, to introduce and expand market-based policies, and to construct modern urban landscapes. So these are cities, Shanghai and New Delhi, these are cities that have explicitly sought to achieve economic engines and global brands, global destinations, in an era of increased intercity competition on a global scale. So this is what we call, in the field of global urban studies, world cities, cities that are seeking a particular kind of global prominence as destinations for investment, tourism, and other kinds of economic and cultural activity. Now, what's interesting to me about this comparison of two cities that began these reforms at around the same time is how similar a lot of the outcomes are. Since the start of this transformation, both cities have experienced rapid increases in inequality and deepening social conflict. So I wanted to know if a comparative study of these two cities would reveal important challenges to building just and sustainable cities both in Asia and beyond. Now, as I said, Shanghai and New Delhi are not representative of cities in the region. They're not even representatives of cities within their respective countries. But, and this is where I think they're important, they are iconic cities. They're cities that represent and reproduce idioms of urbanization and urban change, idioms of globalization, which have decentered places like New York, or at least are beginning the decentering of places like New York and London, Tokyo, and so on, as the primary or only reference for culture, built environment, planning, and other aspects of city making. So what are these idioms? Well, let me turn to the cases as a way of beginning to work through some of the potential answers to that question of these emerging urban idioms on a global scale. So the project itself is organized around the major cultural events that each city hosted in 2010. In Shanghai, it was the World Expo. In New Delhi, it was the Commonwealth Games. Now, there's a whole field of research just looking at the impact of hosting these events on cities. But for the most part, they focus on cities, again, in the north, the cities of the United States, North America, and so on. Furthermore, they tend to be somewhat narrowly focused on very straightforward cost-benefit questions. Do they earn revenue as they promise to do, or do they saddle cities with debt? Important questions, obviously, questions that I ask in my own work as well. But under globalization, the playing field, so to speak, has changed, has shifted, and has broadened. And the 2008 Olympics in Beijing marked a real watershed in locating these events outside of the traditional host cities and host regions. And so what's really interesting to me about both the Commonwealth Games and the Expo, and we'll see this, and we already are seeing this with respect to Brazil, which will host both the World Cup and the Olympics 2 years apart, is that these were explicitly framed by proponents in the process of bidding as development opportunities. Right? So often when you hear these events talked about, especially prior to the global economic crisis, they were framed as opportunities to gain status and prestige. It brought attention to the city. It might bring some tourism. Clearly there's an economic component to that. But here you find that the events were framed primarily for domestic audiences as opportunities for development. They would act as magnets for investment. They would help, again, to brand cities as destinations for tourism, conferences, and all kinds of other cultural activities that cities all around the world compete for incredibly fiercely to bring these events to their cities because there's a lot of money involved. And there's, again, the status issue. Now, arguably, Shanghai had already reached World City status before it hosted this event. And the event was almost more of a coming out, a kind of saying, we've arrived. And certainly it plays into the domestic competition between Beijing and Shanghai for status, given that Beijing had hosted the Olympics only 2 years earlier. Delhi, on the other hand, is arguably at the edge of World City status. It's close. In many ways, it's a central geopolitical city, certainly regionally, but it hasn't reached that status, that World City status that Shanghai has as a cultural hub. And it's unclear at this point, even to me, I think after all of these years of working on this, whether or not the games helped or hurt the effort to become a global city. And maybe some of that will become clear when I get to talking about Delhi. Now, if you think about it, certainly for me, eventually when I was working through some of the original data, that proponents would frame these games, these events, as development opportunities makes sense. In cities with large numbers of poor, of growing inequality, and increasing attention to that inequality, it would be very difficult to get buy-in to an event of this magnitude with these massive expenditures of resources if the officials and boosters behind it couldn't promise wider social benefits. Right? How in a city with growing inequality and growing poverty do you say, let's spend a lot of money on this event because of the status? You have to make an argument that it's going to bring other things to the city, to the population. This included promises about transport upgrading, infrastructure upgrading, venues, sports venues, entertainment venues, jobs, of course, and investment. So in Shanghai, the emphasis on development was built into the theme of the event itself. The theme of the Shanghai Expo was Better City, Better Life. And the event would be organized not only around issues of urban sustainability, green cities, inclusive cities, but the event itself was meant to act as a model, both the event and the preparations for the event, of the principles that the event was promoting. But in Delhi, too, we heard this. And we heard from the India Olympic Association, which is the governing body of the Commonwealth Games. They put out material early on in the bid, after the bid had been gained, I think in 2006. The committee said, the 2010 Games will be a catalyst for the development of the city of Delhi and its environs. New venues will be built, existing world-class venues will be further upgraded, and a range of infrastructure projects which will benefit the population of Delhi and its surrounding areas will be initiated and completed, including technology infrastructure, a comprehensive roads program, and a new metro system. So lots of things being promised riders onto this event. And so my initial interest was in interrogating these events, and specifically the period leading up, the preparations, when most of the dramatic transformation would happen, to see exactly what kind of development they would facilitate or accelerate or initiate. From the perspectives of inequality and justice, what kind of development do these events really foster? Now, one concern that was raised in an earlier period of the research when I first started talking about it was, well, these are really special periods. The period before an Olympics, before an Expo, before a Commonwealth Games are not run-of-the-mill urban politics. So they're not really representative. Will you really be able to tell a lot about urban development in general based on looking at these events? I listened to that criticism over time and I thought about it, and I think, I think it is fair, and I think the data supports it. As I said earlier, for one, the kinds of developments promoted by these events fit very well in line with the development trajectories that were already in play, right? So the initiatives that were being kind of floated as what would be connected to the events didn't deviate from what the cities were already doing. In a sense, they would accelerate them and produce greater benefits to move them along because of the increased investment. So they're not deviations. Furthermore, I think these events in some ways provide a unique opportunity for local governance regimes, local networks of elites, in two ways. First, they allow for rapid urban development that under normal conditions would either be blocked or slowed either by legal action or political protest or by other means. But with the event deadline fixed in stone, a kind of special period is created where the city's plans have to move forward unobstructed. You can't reschedule the Olympics because you're not ready. And this is just as true of democratic India as it is of authoritarian China. The second opportunity is they allow for unbelievable expenditures. Spending on these events in both cities fell right into the pattern we've observed almost everywhere else, most recently in London, that they come in exponentially over budget. They incur debts that it's hard to imagine anything short of war could really justify in such a short time. So you have this incredible political momentum. You have a blank check, so to speak, in a city that's already pursuing this global city, world city agenda. So what's the result? What kinds of city spaces, what kinds of urban spaces emerge? And so to get at this, I looked at a few different themes, and I'll just talk about two tonight. And the two I'll talk about are housing demolition and residential displacement. What's demolished? What parts of the city get demolished? How many people are evicted? And what happens to those who are displaced? Where do they go? And what is it like in the places that they go? And the second issue is transformation of the built and social environment. What's the landscape that emerges as the city redevelops, or at least those parts of the city? Who and what are the resulting places for? Who is meant to be there and who is meant to use them? Now, the larger study includes a lot of other variables. I look at financing, the contracts that cities have to sign with the governing bodies of these events, the role of migrant workers in construction, impacts on the informal economy, right? But for today, I'm just going to talk about these two. And I think these two really get at the fundamental processes of transformation that are underway. And again, these events didn't start this transformation. If anything, they accelerated or intensified it and also focused it on specific geographic areas associated with the events. So housing demolition and residential displacement. So both the Expo and the Commonwealth Games fit into this broader pattern associated with these kinds of large-scale hallmark events. You see a massive housing demolition and massive displacement, primarily of lower-income residents and informal area residents. So in Delhi, activists and former residents of the Yamuna Pushta informal settlement in the inner city, which you see here, linked the bulldozing of 40,000 homes and the eviction of over 140,000 people along the Yamuna riverbed in 2004 to preparations for the events in 2010. This would be part of the future site of the event itself. The courts, interestingly, ruled the settlement illegal, even though it was about 50 years old. They also ruled that it was a source of pollution. And so this fit neatly into themes of beautification that had begun to really percolate in cities seeking to, again, become global world cities. And so the city was given the green light to evict. And residents said that they had very little notification, about a week. This is a 50-year-old settlement. They were given about a week notice, and then the bulldozers and the police showed up. They received no compensation for what they lost in value in terms of homes and possessions. Only those who proved they had lived in the community for at least 20 years were even given any resettlement aid or compensation. And in all, at the end, only about a quarter, or actually less than a quarter of residents were eligible for anything. The rest were left to fend for themselves. And many of those resettled were moved far from the city center to a barren peripheral area with little or no access to public services, transportation, or means of livelihood. One particularly difficult hardship that was introduced as a result of this was for people who commuted. Many of the displaced still made their living in or near the inner city and had to travel every day back in. And often they worked in sectors of the economy, formal and informal, that serviced more affluent residents. So not only did the relocation greatly increase the time that it took to get to work, it also increased the cost, eating into already meager earnings. Now, before its demolition, Yamuna Pushta was, as I said, one of the oldest slums in Delhi, dating back to the early days of independence, the early 1950s, and also one of the largest. As a community, it contained schools, clinics, temples, mosques. It also contained one of only 3 permanent homeless shelters for women. All were torn down, and the Western Riverbed became the location for the Commonwealth Games Village, which housed the athletes for the Games for 2 weeks in October 2010. And this is what it looked like after. Now, closer to the date of the Games in 2007, another 70 farmers near the site lost their land. No warning, no compensation to make way for the Games Village. I spoke with farmers at the site, and what they said was that police and city officials appeared one day and secured the perimeter around the fields and prevented the farmers from going out to work. They had been working this land, again, as with the Yamuna Pushta, dating back to early days of post-independence and land reform, ironically, to make land more accessible to the poor. So these farmers are now forced to rent land from others, and as a result have seen a decline in their incomes. Now, although they're waging a struggle to regain their land, this is the site, one of the sites, and prevent further encroachment, they're fully aware that more development in the area means they will eventually have to move permanently. me get another shot of the same area. Now, in addition to the lost land, activists, including the farmers as well as local environmentalists, are concerned about development of the riverbed area because it's a floodplain. And in a city that's already overwhelmed with yearly flooding, the loss of the floodplain to continued development would not only increase damage from the seasonal monsoons, it would impact especially these farmers, for one, if they're able to remain, but also some of the densely populated low-lying residential areas. So in Shanghai as well, there have been demolitions and evictions on a mass scale all around the city as authorities redevelop central city areas and build or expand the existing metro lines. This is from an area very close to the World Expo site, just to give you some sense of what it looked like. This is, I think, 2008. But some of it also looked like this. The area had in fact been, we're talking about a 5 square kilometer area on both sides of the Huangpu River. It had been working class residential, industrial, light industrial, prior to the implementation of economic reforms in the 90s. But gradually industry moved out to the urban peripheries, far out from the city, and more affluent residents began to move in and property values began to rise. The reforms of the 90s accelerated many of those trends, the ones that were already in motion. When I arrived in 2008 for the first time, most of the Expo area residential areas had already been demolished, so I saw more of this. So this was, in fact, this area had been a residential neighborhood prior to its demolition. Overall, about 90,000 people were displaced just in and around the Expo area. This is not accounting for people or for evictions linked to the Expo, but out in other parts of the city. This is just geographically where the event itself was. About 40,000 were resettled in 2004, and then another 50,000 in 2006. And in the latter eviction, the more recent one, residents were in fact moved to a new development that had been built specifically for them as an Expo resettlement project in an area called Sunlin, east of the downtown core. The new accommodations, I went to see them, were clearly a physical improvement in terms of the infrastructure, at least at first. A few years later, I went back and I heard that the construction was shoddy and things were already beginning to kind of crumble a bit. But at the time I was there, it looked pretty nice. But residents complained that relocation had increased their commute times. They were now very far from their old jobs, neighborhoods, those that remained, if they did, shopping facilities and other conveniences that they previously could access on foot or with a short bus or metro ride. The area they were relocated to in 2008 at least was still virtually undeveloped. You had this big residential complex and a road, and that was kind of it. So even everyday activities like grocery shopping now involved long commutes to go to shopping, which of course also made it more expensive. Many of the elderly in particular complained about being lonely and isolated with the loss of their old, tight-knit communities. Now, unlike in Delhi, the compensation here appears to have been more widespread. Many of the displaced got compensation, and was with the case with the Sunland development, new accommodations, provided they had legal residency. So many of the residents of the demolished areas were migrant workers or migrants who didn't have legal status as Shanghai residents, and they received nothing. And even those who did receive compensation, very few got anything like the development at Sunlin. Some of the people I spoke with said they thought it was more of a kind of showcase, so if displacement was raised, they could show this and say, well, this is how we treated them, but that most of the other resettlement places were not as nice and were much, much further away from the downtown. And of course, residents, especially those at or near the Expo site, had very little room to negotiate or refuse to relocate. So when I spoke to local researchers about this, some said that a number of residents in different neighborhoods would refuse to move. And some saw this as a negotiating strategy. It was a way to really, until the very end, hold out, and so you would have the maximum compensation. And others saw it as genuine efforts to resist what they felt was an injustice. And here you see, this is in the foreground here, one of the last remaining, I didn't get a good picture of the whole site, but it's the only remaining residence in that whole field of rubble. What you see behind it is a different neighborhood. So this is what's sometimes referred to as a nail house. You might have seen other pictures of this from other parts of China where similar demolitions have happened, referring to the fact that the lone house in a field looks like a nail sticking out of the ground. Now, that wasn't the only form of resistance. Demolitions in Shanghai, both those linked to the event and others, have generated years of protests, sustained protests, public marches, public gatherings, lawsuits, and especially attempts to expose the corruption between developers and local officials, and the violence by thugs allegedly hired by developers to force out people who refused to go. So when I walked around, you would see graffiti on the walls saying, you know, the police need to protect the residents against the thugs hired by the developers. And that would often be next to a banner put up by the city saying things like construction makes people's hearts happy. You know, so it was an interesting contrast in messaging. In the end, these were largely unsuccessful, at least the ones, again, near or on the future Expo site. The second theme, transformation of the built and social environments. What's the landscape that emerges from the rubble? Who and what is it for? So in both cases, again, we saw the demolition of existing housing, eviction disproportionately impacting lower-income urban residents, physical relocation to less central areas, effectively changing the social and spatial configuration of not only downtown areas, but the places where they were displaced to. And so, again, I want to look now at what happens in the places that they left. And I'll talk a bit about both on-site redevelopment, meaning redevelopment on the sites where the events happened, and off-site redevelopment. Now, if you look at Delhi, it's not that hard to read the new landscape. This is a placard right in front of the construction site of what would become the Games Village. What's of interest here, just as a bit of a side note, you say Emaar on the left there. Emaar is the name of a Dubai-based property developer. They were the initial financier of the project. It's the largest property developer in all of the Gulf region. They were the ones who put up the money for this transformation of this area and what would eventually become, after the games were over, market rate luxury apartments. And here you see a different view of the same site. I don't know how well it comes out to you in the audience, but you can see some of the renderings of what it will look like in the future on the placards here once it's finished. This is 2009, I believe. And another view of the construction site. Now, since the end of the games, many of these accommodations have been put on the market, and as late as last year, despite the the global housing bubble crash, apartments were selling for $450 per square foot. This is one image of what it looks like now. Now, off-site, the games also contributed to accelerated redevelopment, either existing plans or new plans. In both cities, for example, the events generated momentum and capital to expand the metro systems, right? This is one of the promises made in Delhi. Now, an interesting point in Delhi, when compared to Shanghai, is the redevelopment of a central city hub. This is Rajiv Chowk, also called Connaught Place. The redevelopment of this very important downtown area was meant to be sped along by the games. The games would lead to an infusion of capital that would help to revive this kind of deteriorating area, but still a very important urban center. But it wasn't finished in time. The games came and went, and it wasn't done. Moreover, once the games were finished, the revitalization project just stopped. It was literally left as a construction zone. And I don't know of any comparable situation in Shanghai. The preparations there were done either on or before time, especially those that were in the middle. I mean, this is downtown Delhi, right? I didn't see anything like that in Shanghai. So it's an interesting contrast that maybe we can return to in the discussion. Shanghai on site, on the Expo site, the redevelopment of the Expo site is also kind of an interesting case. I was there in December of 2011, and the entire 5 square kilometer area, most of it is fenced off. And large sections of it seem really to have been completely abandoned since the last of the 70 million visitors left in October of 2010. I wasn't able to get a good shot here. This is from a passing car, but it was the only one I was able to get. At least you see the fencing. You see these are the old Expo facilities that were untouched. When I did get a chance to walk around the grounds, there were tumbleweeds blowing by. I'd never seen a tumbleweed before, and I never thought it would be in Shanghai. Other sections of the site, however, had been transformed and turned into enormously popular entertainment areas. This, of course, is the Mercedes-Benz Arena. It has a huge concert hall, a number of smaller performance spaces and lounges, restaurants, and other amenities. Apparently, just 2 months ago, Jennifer Lopez performed there. Now, interestingly to me, and I'm interested in kind of the global financing of local redevelopment, the arena is owned by Los Angeles-based AEG. And AEG is a massive global entertainment conglomerate. They also own the Oakland Coliseum. And they also manage the Bay Area Breakers Run, which happens here in the city. So Mercedes only leases the title, the naming rights. They don't own the actual arena. That's, again, AEG, based in Los Angeles. So I interviewed some of the Expo officials, or officials in the Department of Planning of the city of Shanghai, who were specifically tasked with working on the Expo. And I also talked to planners working in the private sector, but on Expo-related projects. And no one really seemed to know, this was in 2011, no one really seemed to know what the overall plan was for the area, for this big Expo area. Some of them thought that, well, the city was waiting out the recession before infusing huge amounts of cash and capital into property development. But what there was consensus on was that the end result would be a mixed-use high-end development. Mixed use meaning open green space, high-end hotel and entertainment complexes, and market-rate luxury apartments. And some of that development is already underway, of course, again with this arena. And outside the perimeter, along the roads and areas, neighborhoods just outside the area, hotels have already started coming up. So what this suggests to me, and I think to a lot of the people paying attention to this, is that the former Expo area will eventually resemble and be connected to the already very highly developed areas in downtown, just north of the Expo area and along the western edge of the Huangpu River. Now, off-site, there was also major construction, much of it associated with metro lines, but not all of it. And also these redevelopment and beautification campaigns downtown. And I'll just talk about one of them. Up until 2010, there was a very well-known street food market running along Wujiang Road, which runs right through the heart of downtown. And I wasn't able to get a good picture because I was eating, and at the time I took this, I didn't realize it would be gone. This was 2008, so I didn't realize that this would be my last time there. But in a way, even though it's not a great picture, you can see the writing on the wall in the back. You can see the high-end retail that had come into the area. And officials increasingly saw the street food market as out of step with the kind of environment they wanted to create. So in early 2010, it was moved, and the remaining older buildings were demolished. So the whole area is now being converted into this enormous outdoor pedestrian mall, which includes this new residence, which I haven't been able to visit, but I have a feeling I know what it tastes like. So to summarize, in both cities, the intensification of these changes already underway for the most part were articulated as needs to beautify the city before showing it to the world, before kind of emerging onto the world stage in that visible way. And in both places there was opposition and resistance, but little of it was effective ultimately in preserving the character of neighborhoods and communities, of preserving the familiar. In the end, the result was massive displacement and redevelopment. So by way of concluding, let me return to Henry Paulson. After observing that the local, regional, and global scales are interrelated, and pointing to the central role of the local, of the urban, in shaping the global future, he argues that for China, to meet its urban challenge, it will need to focus on things like smart planning, pollution, and specialized training for China's urban planners. He says nothing about inequality, which, like pollution, has grown noticeably over the past 20 years. And like the smog, he says he can't help but noticing when he looks out of his hotel room in Beijing. Certainly if he was there in the last week, he couldn't have helped but notice it. From the ground, it's difficult to miss the signs of growing inequality, segregation, and conflict. So I have no quarrels necessarily with his prescriptions. I think they're fairly superficial. And what I've tried to do here is capture more substantively the nature of the urban transformations that are occurring in Chinese cities, Indian cities, and really in cities across the world. Engagement with these cities as they really are will have to be grounded in a recognition of three emerging trends and their implications for the global and urban future. First, despite important differences, there is a clear pattern in the spatial reconfiguration of cities. Tang Jiping, a senior urban planner in Shanghai, observed that Shanghai, like so many cities across the region, the Asia-Pacific region, seemed to be hollowing out. Its centers slowly being ceded to a class of globally connected local and foreign residents and visitors. So I've been using the concept of peripheralization to describe this, the pushing of less affluent groups into the urban periphery as a process that defines one of the idioms of urbanization. Second, despite this centrifugal force, this movement out from the center, there are strong countervailing tendencies at work. All cities have or struggle with inequality, and in all of those cities, lifestyles of more affluent populations depend upon the labor of less affluent populations. So as much as middle-class residents in Shanghai and Delhi may want the poor to be invisible, may want them to be out of sight, their very affluence depends upon their labor and therefore their proximity. So spatial distance is constrained by social and economic dependence, and in the case of economics, interdependence. And so this is obviously a broad statement, but I think it's a compelling way to make sense of the urban forms we see at a very fundamental level, this dynamic of distancing and dependency. And finally, and this is the direction my own work is really moving in, these tendencies are both produced by and produce certain kinds of politics. Cities are sites of political centrality as much as they are of population centrality, economic centrality. They're centers of governance, but also of resistance. And new social and spatial configurations of the kind I've described here are already producing political innovations, new ways of reproducing inequality, but also ways of rejecting it and seeking to build a more just city. So in that way, my work is driven by a conviction, or maybe it's just a hope, that the city is central to our democratic future on a global scale. And if I can end on maybe what is somewhat of a dystopian note, I don't know that this is a future, or that this future is one that most of us here will really be central to or even a part of. While segregation, or this distancing, has typically been maintained by more affluent and powerful groups as a social strategy, it may be that at some point in the future, this strategy of distancing becomes a betrayal and the center doesn't hold. If, as the writer Arundhati Roy believes, another world is on her way, it may be that this time we find ourselves the outcasts on the urban periphery. And with that, I'll end, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for some questions, so I'll bring the microphone to you. Does anyone have a question?
You didn't deal very much with the financial ramifications of what has happened to many of these sites where these events took place.
Right.
We know that in many cases the countries themselves were in deep debt afterwards, and therefore it was almost a double whammy as far as the lack of success was concerned. I look at these two cities and I see very innate problems appearing. Mm-hmm. I see, and also too, I've heard broadcasts. For instance, there has been a rash of rape sessions in the Indian country, women being treated very poorly. And then also, too, the other factor in China certainly seems to be the heavy pollution that has threatened the health of the people, and certainly, I would say, is a lack of help as far as making these cities viable places for people to live. So I'm just wondering why you didn't address those issues, which in my mind are as important as the ones that you did cover.
You're right. I think they are as important. And so the financial part I do deal with in the research. I just didn't talk about it today, but it's one of the things that I look at. What kinds of financial difficulties did hosting these events pose for particular cities, and who was impacted by those difficulties? Because even if a city is financially strapped as a result of this, there are still decisions to be made about where to spend and how to spend. And I don't see at this point any real lessons learned in terms of the cities themselves. Interestingly, maybe that's not entirely true. I was there in Shanghai in 2011. I was riding in the car with a friend of mine who is from Shanghai, but also a researcher. And he was saying, a poll just came out of residents of Shanghai whether should Shanghai bid for the Olympics. And the overwhelming answer was no. People did not want that again, right? That doesn't mean it won't happen, right? But, to the extent that that a lesson was learned that somehow percolated through the population, I don't know, but that was the clear takeaway. And I think similar, although I haven't seen polls, but just in terms of my own work in Delhi and in Cape Town, huge buyer's remorse around that. The pollution, I agree. I think there's no way around that as a fundamental problem. My argument, I think, is that you won't really deal with the pollution until you deal with the disempowerment of the majority of the population. And as long as you have urban politics that drive the population physically, politically, socially away from the centers of power, you won't really deal with these problems. What you'll do is get increasingly contained, purified air areas where people who can afford them will go into and everyone else is left outside. And that's not equilibrium, right? That situation doesn't hold. Eventually something gives. And I think everyone knows that. And so that raises, then that's what I mean about the political challenges that all of this ultimately poses.
Since you mentioned that from all this development, we're seeing the victory of the powerful over the unpowerful, over the poor people. And right now, you're saying that eventually there's somewhere it's going to give. Okay, but looks like right now there doesn't seem like any kind of progress on both front, either Shanghai or in New Delhi, for the people. So what kind of giving are you mainly referring to?
I think, well, in China in particular, and I don't want to speak beyond because I'm not a China specialist, I think there's a cumulative effect to the protest that's happening. A few years ago when I was trying to get some kind of broader general data on China and India, I came across reports about political unrest in China. And an organization had compiled a database based on just things that could be documented. And per capita, it has the highest rate of protest of any country in the world, right? That, I think, has a cumulative effect. I don't know what that will be. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to end up positively, but that's what I mean about something will eventually give. And I'm hoping that through the process of struggle around protecting housing, protecting wages, you see factory workers in different parts of China in the wake of the recession going on strike, right? That will develop or further develop what there already is a political culture, but will further develop that political culture and give it a strength that eventually is able to leverage something long-term and sustainable for those populations. Delhi is a very different category in some ways. It's a democracy. It's a very vibrant democracy in some respects. It's multi-party. Until some of these more recent transformations, the poor actually had a relatively large amount of power because local officials depended upon them for patronage votes. But that system has been transformed, I think, because of that reason, to kind of bypass the political power of the urban poor. But they know this. And so political mobilization there is a long tradition. It's very strong. It's a question of when can people who are so strapped for resources, they're just trying to survive, when can they mobilize their political power in a way that challenges the entrenched structures of politics and economy and so on. So I don't say, when I make those remarks about political innovations, it's not about I see some kind of I don't see a guaranteed positive outcome. But if something is going to happen positively, I think it'll happen in these places which we don't really fully understand, meaning not the cities themselves, but those parts of the cities that we have less and less access to.
I had a question about, mundane question about the debris. What did they do with all the bricks? And I saw some of the trucks, looks as if they were picking out the metal for recycling. But do you have any idea what they did with all the bricks? Because there must have been an enormous quantity of rubble there.
That's I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know what they did with it.
Well, San Francisco wants to fill in the bay more to add another runway.
That's right. So I think some kind of globalization could occur.
This is slightly off topic, but you mentioned that the APR was the number 2 fastest growing urban area. What is the number 1 fastest growing urban area?
Sub-Saharan Africa.
What cities?
And it's also the least urbanized. So so China was the APR was the second least urbanized. Sub-Saharan Africa is the most unurbanized. Asia Pacific is the second fastest urbanizing Sub-Saharan Africa. So partly it's because it's the least urbanized, so it has the most urbanizing to do. But it's and I'm not as familiar with beyond Southern Africa, but it's the cities that we're more familiar with, the major capitals, the major economic centers of Central, Eastern, and Western Africa, but also cities, the medium-sized cities. Most of the urban growth, and I said earlier, we have another 40, 50 years of urban growth before it plateaus. Most of that growth will not happen in the cities, the big cities. Those are, in a sense, kind of maxed out. It will happen in the smaller cities. So many of them are cities that I don't actually know. I mean, I could talk about in South Africa, cities like Port Elizabeth that are less well known than Cape Town and Johannesburg. But if you talk about, in Kenya or Ghana, outside of Accra and Nairobi and the more well-known cities, there are medium-sized cities that are doing a lot of the absorbing. And so there's a diffusion of urbanization in that way as well.
I was interested in kind of the broad overall picture of what happens. India, of course, is touted as the world's largest democracy. And then China, of course, is well known as a very autocratic country. So when they approach a issue like urbanization, do these competing visions of government affect their approach to urbanization? I was thinking, for example, you mentioned in India there was an instance where in a week's time, the police came in and the people were not warned, they weren't compensated. And my initial reaction was, wow, that sounds like what an autocratic government will do. And yet you were talking about India. So that's kind of what I was wondering.
Yeah, and that is one of, it's one of the parts of the research that's most interesting to me, is that another way to to reframe your comment is the question of, does the formal system of governance really make a difference in terms of the ultimate impacts on the urban poor, right? So far, I would say the answer is no. And that's why I say these are interesting questions about democracy, not just because we're talking about China, but because we're talking about countries that are democracies. And I also work in South Africa, which is a democracy, same thing. Now, there are differences. I mean, I think when I say we don't see a lot of differences in outcomes, that's a statement that has to be then qualified for the next 45 minutes in a sense, right? There are important differences in terms of how things play out. There are important differences in terms of where populations have opportunities to protest or to leverage, right? So in India or in Delhi, there are certain avenues of the urban poor that they can leverage that are not available in Shanghai, and vice versa. So for example, in terms of housing, one of the things that was interesting to me about the way that people protested the demolition of housing, the eviction, the lack of compensation, was that this is a communist country, and the state is has committed itself in principle to providing basic services for the poor. This is a violation of the social contract, right? That I didn't hear in Delhi. Well, in South Africa a little bit because of the post, the Mandela and then the ANC taking of leadership. People will refer back to documents before the ANC took power saying, look, these are the programs you promised once you came into power, and now they're gone. And so the protests evoke those. So there are differences in how these things play out. But for me, being interested in, well, one, the ultimate outcomes in terms of the impacts on these populations, and the question of politics. What does it mean to build democracy when you have two different systems of government producing similar outcomes vis-a-vis vulnerable populations? It certainly challenges the notion that implementing democratic institutions and making sure they're vibrant is all you need to do. But there's something else about democracy that's not just about having multi-parties, elections, federal system, that democracy lies somewhere else than in those institutions. And that's, again, why I talk about these emerging peripheral areas as emerging centers. So it's not Shanghai or Delhi that's an emerging center, in a sense. It's parts of those cities that increasingly become the homes of the majority of the urban residents. And in those places are where the innovations, I think, will probably emerge. And they may look very different from what we think democracy looks like. Unless anyone want to ask a first question, otherwise I'd be happy to take another.
I actually have a question.
Oh, okay.
I was struck when I was looking at the photos of the English that is used alongside the native language, the Chinese,
yes.
In particular. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the marketing in English of these cities.
Yeah, the use of English. So the use of English, at least in terms of the way I come at that issue, is that's part of the global branding. Right, that English is still the language of globalization. And so when these cities are seeking to become world cities, they are very attentive to using English language. I mean, India's, of course, it was an English colony, so English is kind of a common language there anyway, and particularly in Delhi, the capital. But Shanghai as well, I was struck by how much of the landscape, how much of the landscape you see English. I mean, every road sign, every street sign, and back streets, and you look, and it's in Mandarin and in English. And that's part of how I think they imagine creating this global space, the space that is not somehow distinguished from the global and the general in that sense, but is very much a part of it, and through that then can begin to exercise power as defining what globalization is. One interesting thing about that is that I didn't see a single banner, not a single, but the vast majority of banners around the beautification campaign were not in English. They were directed at the residents of the city. They were not meant to be read in that sense by visitors, right, about how people should change their habits. And remember, the world is watching. Those were all, virtually all, I think, in Mandarin. So we have a couple of first-timers, and then I'll come. One right here, this woman in the...
Thank you. It seems then that this is more an economic issue than a political issue, than a social issue, because all these cities are vying for global success. And so at the expense of, demolishing housing units, in poorer neighborhoods and then relocating, it's really about getting the global business. Like Shanghai is, just an amazing city. And when I just recently visited there, I was amazed at all the people. When you go to the zoo or something, it's not a bunch of Caucasians anymore. It's the Asian people with their families. They've accumulated some prosperity. They're able to take their kids out and enjoy what visitors usually did. And I don't know if this economic progress has affected each city in the same way.
Again, as with the question of democracy, there are some striking similarities. One is, of course, the rise of large middle-class groups. Right? So both China and India have seen the emergence of, numerically speaking, huge middle classes. And they, in many ways, have been a major impetus for some of these redevelopment campaigns because they want access to these things. And that dovetails with notions of what does a modern city look like? And who do you look to if you want to make your city look modern? What does modern mean in terms of urban form? And so for a long time, and still very much so today, Those were primarily cities in the United States and Europe and Australia, as I mentioned. But that's shifting. So there's been some interesting work about how in places like Delhi, and especially in Mumbai, Shanghai is the model. So the question among kind of urban elite in Mumbai is, how do we do what Shanghai did? Not New York, Shanghai, right? So, and that's part and parcel of this attempt to kind of create, for those who have the means, a modern middle-class urban form of life, right? And that means big changes have to happen. And there are clear beneficiaries of that, right? I mean, I don't want to suggest that there aren't lots of people in these cities who would look at everything I just said and thank God that happened, right? But it's a minority. It's an urban minority, and it's a global minority. And that raises, for me, real questions about justice, inequality, and democratic futures.
We're going to take one more question, and then if you have another question, we can even talk to Dr. Samara about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just was curious that in this country we've got preservation societies, historic preservation, and I think that there's some NGOs that are working internationally. Are there any local groups in either Delhi or Shanghai of any that have any clout in terms of trying to put their finger in the dike of what seems like an inevitable onslaught?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's an issue that I came across, particularly in Shanghai, but it's a question where I feel like I got information about that, but it wasn't something I was looking at specifically. So I'll tell you what I saw and heard. In Shanghai, the issue of historical preservation was huge because they were tearing down old historic structures left and right. I mean, just gone. I actually have a friend. She's from Singapore, but she's a photographer living in Shanghai, and for the last 5 years, she's been running around the city photographing old Shanghai before it disappears. She has a great blog called Shanghai Street Stories where the photographs are located. And so I would read her blog and talk to her, and she was the one who would give me a lot of information about this. And there were some international NGOs working on historic preservation, but there were a lot of Chinese scholars, for example, who were also alarmed by this and trying to get the city to just kind of slow down and say, we need to preserve some of our heritage. So I can't tell you, what I can tell you is that the feeling of the people that I've spoken to is that its heritage will essentially be gone fairly soon. That whatever efforts exist will be so small, maybe a little settlement here, that they'll be virtually, irrelevant in terms of really preserving historic Shanghai. The other part of that, though, is that the city has taken the issue up and has promoted historical preservation, but primarily, again, I don't want to say primarily because I don't know, but one of the ways they've done that is through redeveloping in old historical styles. But so they look, they kind of at some level look like the old housing, but they're market rate, they're luxury, or they're shopping malls. So they're saying, yeah, this is a form of historical preservation. But again, because it's not something I was looking at specifically, I don't want to say too much more about how extensive but everything I heard was that the historic part of the city is essentially gone, that it's just been boom. Delhi's a much harder place to talk about history. The city's 3,500 years old. It was the seat of 7 empires. Everywhere you turn, there's historic monuments. But most of them are not marked or fenced off. You can walk down the street and there's the remains of a mosque that's 300 years old. And it's just there, and you can just walk around it. And sometimes there's signage. Some of them have been turned into little parks. But it's sometimes called the city of monuments because they're everywhere. So in that sense, I don't feel like the historic preservation of Delhi is really in any danger. Most of the stuff has been allowed to kind of let time take its toll anyway, and yet it's still, the history of Delhi is palpable in a way that it is almost nowhere else that I've ever been. And in terms of the comparison, I don't know if the elites in Delhi could demolish the historical heritage even if they wanted to.
Please join me in thanking Professor Samara for that wonderful and very insightful talk.
Thank you.